All right, hey there, everybody. We are talking about proteins today, carrying on with the third type of biological molecule that we are learning about. Remember, we've already talked about carbohydrates and lipids, and so now we're talking about proteins, another class of biological molecule. So here we've got proteins. Now, if you remember, we've had carbohydrates. Just do a little bit bigger. So we've talked about carbohydrates. Remember that they have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We've talked about lipids. They also have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in them. And now we're talking about proteins. And proteins have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So one of the differences between proteins and carbohydrates and lipids is this nitrogen here. Some proteins have sulfur. We'll talk a little bit about that, but there's very little sulfur. Not a lot of sulfur, but there is a little bit of sulfur. Okay, the building block, the monomer for proteins is something called an amino acid. So amino acids, we can put them together using something called a peptide bond. So here, these connections between the amino acids, these are the peptide bonds that we're seeing here. And if we look at the this example here, we've got each of these dots represents an amino acid. Right, these are the amino acids here and here. And what's connecting them is these peptide bonds. So the covalent bond that connects the amino acids, that's called a peptide bond. So these here, use a different color. These here are the peptide bonds. And it's a type of covalent bond. When we put a bunch of amino acids together using those peptide bonds, we create something called a polypeptide. So a polypeptide is another word for a protein. The polypeptide, we'll talk a little bit, when we talk about structure, means something a little bit different, but for right now, you can assume that a polypeptide equals many amino acids connected with peptide bonds. So essentially, this is a protein. If you just have two amino acids together, so if we go like this here, so if you just have two amino acids together, 1, 2, held together by a peptide bond, here's our peptide bond connecting the two, then this would be a dipeptide. This here looks like Baymax. This here is a dipeptide. And if you put 3, 1, 2, 3 peptides together, connected by peptide bonds. If you put 3 amino acids held together by peptide bonds, we would call this a tripeptide. So we can have amino acids is the monomer. Amino acid is the monomer. If we put 2 amino acids together with a peptide bond, that's called a dipeptide. If we put 3 amino acids together, we call it a tripeptide. And if you have a lot of amino acids together, then we call it a polypeptide. So it's not a mono amino acid, it's not a diamino acid, it's a dipeptide. We name them by the bond. So we'll learn a little bit more about this later on here, but proteins have lots of functions. They can be enzymes, Our muscle fibers are made of protein. Fingernails, hair, skin, those sorts of supporting structures are also made of proteins. Antibodies are made of proteins. Some chemical messengers. I know that we said that some hormones are made of lipids, or a lot of hormones are made of lipids, but you can also have protein chemical messengers that communicate between cells and organ systems. And some of them are stuck in the membrane and have different functions in the cell membrane. And we'll talk more about that as we go along here. But you should know that the functions of proteins are to act as enzymes, to help organisms move through muscle function, provide structure and support, fingernails, hair, skin. They find and destroy pathogens. Remember, this is our immune system. This is our immune system here. We're part of our immune system. The immune system is what keeps you healthy. It fights disease. The immune system fights illness and disease. And your antibodies are a big part of the immune system. They can help us communicate between cells and organ systems. Those are called chemical messengers. And then they transport materials in and out of cells. Those are called membrane proteins. Here's some pictures of what we're talking about. So here, the name of this protein here is called keratin. Keratin is the hair protein. And there's some other structures that go along with that, or some other substances, I should say. Here's a muscle, and here's the muscle fibers. The two fibers that muscles use are called actin and myosin. And so here we've got actin and myosin working together. So here's our So like this is, one of these is actin, the other one's myosin. So here's, I think this is myosin. And actin. And what they do is they slide over top of each other. So this actin filament here will slide over the myosin. It's actually these parts of the myosin protein that use ATP energy and help to pull. These essentially catch on to the actin filaments and pull them this way to squeeze your muscle, and then they let go to release your muscle, and they relax, and the muscle goes back to its normal length. So you can see here's a muscle contraction. Right, muscle squeeze. When the muscle squeezes, that's called a muscle contraction. Okay, I digress. We're going to talk specifically about enzymes, but basically enzymes speed up chemical reactions here. So enzymes are a really important type of protein. Here's the protein here. These are the proteins that are stuck inside of the cell membrane. So plasma membrane can also be called the cell membrane, or the cell membrane is also known as the plasma membrane. The cytoplasm, this just means inside the cell. We'll talk more about this later. Inside the cell, extracellular fluid. This is outside the cell. Again, we'll talk about this later. But yeah, proteins move substances. They move them in and out of the cell. So this molecule here is moving into the cell through this channel protein, or this carrier protein. And so that's helping it move from outside the cell to inside the cell. Here's an example of a protein chemical messenger. This is called a neurotransmitter. So this here, these little red dots here, these are called neurotransmitters. And their job is to help one nerve cell, so a neuron is just the scientific word, the biological word for a nerve cell. And then here's another Here's another neuron down here. This is the receiving neuron. This is the sending, this neuron up here. This neuron up here is sending the message, and this neuron down here is receiving the message. And it does that. There's an electrical signal kind of comes down this. The electrical signal comes down the nerve cell. And when that electrical signal gets to the end here, the end of that nerve cell, there's all these little bubbles, they're called vesicles, and they're full of a protein called a neurotransmitter. And what happens is that now when that electrical signal reaches the end of the nerve cell, the end of the neuron, those vesicles, they join up with the cell membrane and they release their neurotransmitter into this space here, and the neurotransmitter goes across and sticks onto the next neuron, the receiving neuron. And then that signal, now that all of these neurotransmitters are here stuck onto these receivers, now what will happen is another electrical signal. This will start another electrical signal down to the next neuron, down to the next nerve cell. So these are protein chemical messengers. Here's the antibodies. Remember, this is part of our immune system. And so here they are identifying, these antibodies are identifying cells or viruses that do not belong in our body. So in other words, they are invading, they're not from our body, they are invading our body. And we call these the pathogens. So these are pathogens, things that make us sick. And so the antibodies will stick to, you can see here it's kind of stuck to this cell, and it will clump them together. It'll group them together kind of like this over here. It'll group them all together, and then our body can get rid of them. It can come along, our body will come along and destroy all these things. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about is nucleic acids.